I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. You know, when we hear the media and politicians talking about climate targets, we often hear about the year 2030. And this week, we'll be doing a short episode focused on what's behind the 2030 target and why it's so important. So before we dig in, wanted to acknowledge the disappointing, albeit not surprising, decision of the U.S. Supreme Court to limit the ability of our Environmental Protection Agency to regulate carbon emissions. You know, frankly, just underscores the importance of, getting legislation passed in the Senate, because we can't rely on, a body like that that's out of touch with the reality of climate change and the threat it poses to be deciding our fate. So, had a good run yesterday to process my frustration. But yeah, I think now it's just all about pushing on the Senate, given that we're just a vote or so short of getting what we need. I don't know, Todd, you have thoughts?
Well, obviously it was frustrating, but I would say it really caught me off guard. I didn't really know this was coming, but I mean, I don't find it that surprising. Obviously this court is in particular on a roll here, and it's, kind of a scary thing to see this, whatever this logic is that they're using to kind of overturn, decades of precedent, and really with kind of an agenda behind it. And I know it's usually the right who has a lot of criticism of the courts and the government and kind of overstepping, and I don't really see how you could view a lot of this as anything but that. And it just yeah, it's really pretty staggering. So
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest lesson learned for me is, you don't leave environmental policy up to, you know, 9 people in black robes. You need to really get that done at the legislative level. So that's why we got to lean on our representatives to get this addressed.
right. Yep, I agree. So moving on, when it comes to climate targets, most of us are familiar, with kind of the basic numbers. We need to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius or less. We need to cut our emissions by half or close to half by 2030, with the next goal of reaching net zero by 2050. And I guess one of the questions is, why do we need a 2030 target and then a 2050 target?
Yeah, I, in prep for this episode, had to get a little more versed on the rationale myself. I think I had
Mm-hmm.
assumed it was a way to really track progress. In other
Right.
words, if you have kind of a middle target, then you know whether you're on track or not. But there's
Mm.
actually more to it than that. In the big scheme, what really matters is, how hot we get, how
Mm.
long we stay hot, and then how quickly temperatures decline. And the best way to think about that is in relation to, all of the glaciers around the world, right?
Yeah.
How much those melt is directly impacted by the temperature, how long we stay at that temperature, and the rate of decline.
Right.
And we all know temperature is driven by, the concentration of CO2 and related global warming pollutants in the atmosphere. Now, there's a little bit of a temperature lag. It's kind of like car parked in the sun, right? You park a car in the sun, it doesn't get hot right away, but if you come back to it an hour later, things are pretty warm. And that's sort of the
Right.
same way, CO2 concentrations go up, and then it takes a little while for the temperature to catch up. And so that all really leads into the idea of what we call like a carbon budget. So we put a lot of carbon up there. We're already sitting at about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming. And so scientists have said, we basically have this remaining carbon budget that we need to stay within.
Mm.
And so the 2030 target is really about ensuring that we curb our CO2 output sooner. And then by doing that, that gives us more time to work within that budget to deal with more difficult to address sources. Because we know we have things like wind and solar and electric vehicles, but there are a lot of sectors that are harder to abate, and we're going to need more time. And so if we can hit 2030, it gives us that longer runway before we run out of that carbon budget.
I get you. So it's not like a great idea to not do anything until 2030 and then plan to like hit it hard.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or often referred to as the IPCC, they've modeled hundreds of different scenarios looking at sources of emissions. And in each of those scenarios, they're looking at, how quickly we reduce our emissions and then what that results in terms of temperature. And then they have like a probability they assign to that.
Mm,
And the reality is, we're putting out way too much CO2 right now to stay within that our carbon budget and keeping temps, at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And, there's a lot of folks that are now saying that 1.5 is probably not realistic, but every tenth of a degree we go above it, conditions get much worse.
mm,
Worse
mhm.
floods, worse droughts, more fires, more sea level rise. And more significant than that is the fact that we get to what scientists call a climate tipping point, where we can't bring things back into balance with the way they are, and we don't really have control over what takes place after that, and more of a doomsday sort of scenario. So
I see.
2030 is very important because it enables us to stay on track to stay as close as we can to that magic 1.5.
Right. So it's really important that we put in our investments now, right, and get that compound interest going.
That's right.
So are we currently on track to hit 2030?
The short answer is no. But
No.
and this is important. Experts agree that we can still get there, and that was really the latest message of the most recent assessment completed by the IPCC back, this spring. Is they said, "Hey, look, we're not on the right path, but there are many paths that enable us to get back to where we need to be."
Mhm.
And the key, as you can imagine, is, acting more quickly. So things like wind and solar are on the right track. Electric vehicles, have had an annual growth rate over the last 5 years of about 50%. So
Huge.
it really is about moving faster, and moving
Yeah.
faster is about having more aggressive, policy in place. If we talk about the big players like Europe, the US, China, India, and Japan, right there, that's about two-thirds of global emissions. And Europe, to their credit, is on the cusp, fingers crossed, of passing a robust climate plan. Not to say it couldn't be more aggressive, but
Yeah.
they're definitely leading the way. The US, not surprisingly, we are lagging there. And while there are states that have stepped up, we still need the federal government to pass climate legislation.
Yeah.
And if we look at China, which is really the other major player at about 30% of global emissions, they're lagging as well. But there are tools that Europe is helping put in place. They call like a border adjustment, which is sort of like a tax on carbon for incoming goods,
Mm.
that will help act as a stick to encourage China to move in the right direction. And if the US moves in that same direction, that's another stick. And so, at least my humble opinion, that's going to be the best way to get China to change. You're hitting them with taxes on their goods until they have, similarly aggressive climate policies in place.
Right.
So, obviously, we're talking about something that feels really scary. It feels big. It feels like, hey, what can I do as an individual that's really going to make a difference? But the reality is, when we look at Europe and the momentum that's taking place there, that's not an accident. That's coming from political pressure from individuals who are trying to hold their governments accountable. And the reason that climate legislation is being talked about in the US is the exact same thing. In the spirit of that, want to give folks a couple organizations that they could look into and potentially volunteer with. Uh, 350.org is an international organization focused on aggressive policies to get to 100% renewable energy as well as divestment. So look them up. And another global organization, Citizens Climate Lobby, is focused on passing a price on carbon, the kind of price that we need to get us back to where we can hit that 2030 target. And they too have chapters around the world. So check out 350.org or Citizens Climate Lobby, both great organizations and both give you the opportunity to get involved. So, I don't know,
Yeah.
Todd, what do you think?
Well, in light of our recent Supreme Court decision that we discussed, that having, strong leadership that's focused on climate change is more important than ever. And coming up here in several months is, the midterm elections, and obviously this one is going to be huge, for the future of climate. This could be a watershed moment one way or the other. So that means we've really got to figure out how to support the right candidates in the right races, either by donating or getting involved somehow to help out. Just kind of a rallying cry to get ready for the midterms coming up.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, at the end of the day, if we have the right elected officials in office, climate legislation happens. And I do think that 2030 is still achievable. And I don't say that from my own expertise. That's really deferring to all these experts. And in reading what they have to say, they're all very clear that this next year or two really determines our direction. And that all depends on, getting aggressive policies in place. So that's a wrap for our short episode this week. Next week, we will be talking about the promise of e-bikes as a climate solution with the director of marketing from Trek Bicycles. So pretty excited about that. Come back and tune in. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimists Podcast.